Good morning, everyone. Good to see you. Thanks for turning on your video for those who can, and totally understand for others who may not be able to for various reasons. But it's good to see you here. I'm glad that you all are able to come together again to move our mutual work forward. As always, just make sure that you're taking care of your needs. Feel free to open up the chat, as we all know that that gets really active. And let's see, why don't we move forward, because I think most of the folks on the call right now have been here and they know all the logistics. So for the meeting series results today, what we wanted to take you all through is to have the opportunity to, I don't know, Peyton, if you can bring up the meeting series slide. There we go. Thank you. Sorry, I skipped over one. We have to start with gracious space. That's where we always start. So the opportunity for gracious space is for us to really kind of be mindful. It's the opportunity for personal reflection, which is really important as we think about person, role, system, and you think about those concentric circles. And that consciousness is really important because it helps and can influence the decisions that you make and the actions that you ultimately take to move the work forward. So some context for this particular gracious space is I was recently introduced to a person by the name of Daniel Kahneman. Some of you may have read some of his books. He's pretty famous. He's a psychologist and an economist, and he's written several books and is a respected expert on behavioral and cognitive biases and behavioral economics in particular. And one of the things that Daniel Kahneman talks about is that we generally, as people, fall into two categories. And this becomes particularly acute in times of crises, kind of like what we're going through right now. So it may really come up in us as individuals. And the two types are this idea of, are you a fixer or are you a builder? And this idea of a fixer, the way he describes a fixer is, you know, when a crisis hits, you're the first on the scene. You are there ready to help out and lend a helping hand. And you're really looking to, you're seeking stability and you're seeking control. And a lot of times if you're a fixer, you tend to use words like renew or rebuild. The other type of person is a builder. And the builder is the person who kind of sits back and watches, tends to seek growth and fulfillment, and might use words like create and explore. Now, one is not better than the other by any means. You have to have both. But just that recognition of where you tend to be, especially in a time of crisis, because that's when it really comes out, is really important. So I'm going to have you just take a moment and reflect on if you're a fixer or if you're a builder. Take a minute, think about that. Jot it down if you have to. And as I said, it's important to have multiples. One is not better than the other. They both play really, really important roles, but it's important to have that consciousness because that can influence the decisions that you make. And so as we think about going into breakout groups, the opportunity for discussion is share. If you haven't met each other, please introduce yourselves in the breakout groups and share the role that you tend to take up. And then also share, how do you interact with people who take up the other role? Okay, and Vicki has added in the chat the questions, so you'll have those for your breakout groups. And so Vicki, if you can, transport folks into their small groups. When we come back, we'll invite people to share as we always do. So enjoy your gracious space with each other. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Okay. We've had a few other folks join that stayed in the main group. So I want to invite folks to share either their own reflection about that or share your discussion. You can either unmute or feel free to join and share in the chat. What kind of reflections did you have about that?
Well, I can go since I popped in early accidentally. Hi, everybody. Debbie Lacey, Eastside for All. So we had a good conversation about my partners in the group were probably more fluid than I am between the two modes, but we've had an interesting conversation about what stress and crisis brings out and our tendencies during those modes. And so what we overall discussed is that we may have our preferred tendency or mode, but clearly we need the other. And there's shadow and light to both, right? So the key is to stay in the gifts and the light of our own style while honoring that in the other, and try to hold on to that in moments of stress.
I love that way that you said that, Debbie, the light and the dark. I have to remember that. Thank you. Thanks, Colleen. I see you added in the chat as well. Most organizations need both. Builders might do better in new programs while fixers have a lot to contribute to established orgs trying to stay relevant. Super. Any other reflections? Do you find how do you actually interact? Any reflections on how you interact with the other?
Stephanie, this is Sue. I think that what we talked about was the fact that it can be very situational. I mean, sometimes you jump right in if the situation calls for it. Other times, there's time to sit back, observe, develop a plan, and move ahead. And I think maybe people have a tendency to be one or the other more often, but I think very often it's people can do both depending on what's required.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great addition. And especially in this work, it can change from time period to time period. I was going to say moment to moment. It's generally not that fast, but that we can take up different roles depending on the situation. And that's why it's really important, I think, to be mindful of what's happening in the current work, the roles that you are currently taking up and feeling comfortable and kind of lean towards, and the roles that others take, because that mutual, it's again thinking about that person, the role, and the system. So as a system, you can move the work forward, and people are taking up the various roles that have to be taken up. Great.
I was going to share that in our discussion, I brought up trusting the other person and how that influences how like the interaction is, like if depending upon if you're someone more fluid moving back and forth, but if depending upon in the organization, if there's a certain dynamic, then how they work how you work together with that person, it can make a huge difference of how cohesive the thought can be to meet the goal.
That's awesome. It makes me think, Heather, of the accountability and the accountability pathway. I mean, we're trusting that the others are going to hold themselves accountable, and we're helping hold them accountable for the role that they play. As we said, both roles are important. One is not necessarily better than the other. So having that trust in each other, I think that's a great addition. Thank you. Any other thoughts or comments on that? Okay, let's move on. So the meeting results for today, you've already done gracious space, that mindfulness, really working to build the container, which is strengthening the relationships, you will have the opportunity to go back and look at shared performance measures, reminding of the quote that was shared last week or the week before, that coalitions are empty without shared measure and shared performance measure. And so this idea of really deepening, how are we measuring, first of all, what's that commonality that we have? What's the common area of work, and how are we measuring that in our work and holding ourselves accountable? You'll also have the opportunity to go into differentiated work. There's going to be a deeper discussion on BART, so you'll have an opportunity to talk about boundaries, authority, role, and task. So that clarity in your work moving forward. And as always, the opportunity to firm up action commitments. We may have some folks who are joining us who've been invited into your focus groups. We're also going to kind of play it by ear a little bit and be able to pivot our design depending on if we have enough folks for the different focus groups. If we do, then we'll go to focus groups. If not, then we may pivot to stay here. So we'll keep an eye on that. So those folks will likely be joining in the latter part if they haven't joined already. I can't see everybody on my screen, but moving forward on the meeting series types. So as we go into BART, the boundary, authority, role, and task, that is your information to really firm up strategy and action depending on your BART. And as well as making sure that that accountability is strengthened, that accountability that Heather kind of brought up as well. As we have invited other stakeholders to come into this work, the area that can really be strengthened here is information shared, and of course, feedback and input secured. So those are kind of the highlights for opportunities for this coming together. And then moving forward on working agreements, just wanted to remind everybody, these are the working agreements that you have come up with. So take a moment and look at those. If there's anything that you don't feel like you're able to agree with, feel free to put that into the chat, or any adjustments or additions that need to be made. And this is also where we're holding each other to accountable for our own working agreements with each other. Any adjustments that need to be made? I don't see anybody's hand going up. Okay. Let's move forward. One of the things that I wanted to just provide a little bit of insight into, and we're calling this executive insight only because I'm an executive director, but one of the things that we hear often is we don't have people with the right power and authority to move this work forward. And we just want to lift up that we all have power and influence, as we've talked about, and we will even more even in BART, but we have informal influence. We have influence in our spheres of friends, our work colleagues, etc. And being really thoughtful in one particular area about how you might be able to think and act politically. So there may be some times where you might think, I'm doing this work, I'm coming to this call every week, I'm working with these other people in this focus group, and I don't know how I can bring this work back to my organization, for example, or does my supervisor, my boss, even know what I'm doing in this work? How can I influence what's happening back in my organization? I don't feel like I have the authority to do that. Well, one of the things that you can think about doing is, for me, and what I really look for from my team is, I know that I have a limited capability and limited view into the work, all the work that's happening within the organization. So I really look to my team to come to me with, okay, this is what's happening with my time. These are the things that I'm doing in this particular time. This is how it's influencing the work that I'm doing, or these are suggestions on how I can change what I'm doing or modify what I'm doing. And I know that sometimes and the specificity in that is really, really important. I know, obviously, too, that there might be environments where you may not feel comfortable having those relationships, those conversations in that relationship with a supervisor, for example. And so this is where you can really think about activating yourself, either by utilizing folks that you know in this call who might be able to have a conversation with your supervisor if they know them, or who are others within your sphere of influence who might be able to have that conversation to create the environment so that there is a comfort in having these discussions. Because the reality is, not being able to have these discussions internally is going to stop the work from moving forward. As we've talked about before, we can't get to better outcomes for children, youth, families, if we're not recognizing how we are interacting with each other and oftentimes creating barriers. If you guys are doing this work in a focus group and you know there's an opportunity to make some modifications or tweaks within your organization, for example, but you don't feel comfortable bringing that up to a supervisor, then things aren't really going to change. And so how is it that you can activate your sphere of influence to create that environment so that those conversations can happen? And for me, again, I really appreciate when folks on my team come with specificity, are open and direct, or again, being able to utilize the expertise that we have on these teams in this particular call. So I don't know, does anybody have any thoughts, or is there any aha around that for you, or have you run into that kind of barrier in your own particular environments? I also want to invite the rest of our team to add anything that might be helpful from your perspective in working on a team like ours.
I can provide a little bit of, like, just speaking for myself, I think one of, when I went through the adaptive leadership program, one of the things they said jokingly at the beginning was that Leadership Eastside causes job changes and divorces. And people who've been through the program laugh because they know how true that is. And I can offer that I really struggled to continue to work within the organization I was working in because the culture was not adaptive, it was technical. And as you think and breathe and move adaptively, when the environment around you isn't supportive of that, it's really challenging. Because adaptive leadership says, regardless of my authority, my opinion is helping inform how we might do things differently. And so one of the things I appreciate about working for Eastside Pathways and the culture that we have in our team is that everybody's perspective is an aha around how we might work differently to serve more and be better and grow and continuously improve. And so I think I'm very thankful for that. And I recognize also that the majority of my career has not been that sort of work environment, and recognizing that we all hold different levels of authority in our areas of focus. And some of those challenges is if you don't have that work culture, it's sometimes hard to get the support, resources, and backing to move things that are unknown or might seem risky and things like that. So just naming that I've experienced the contrast of trying to do adaptive work in a technical environment that only wants things that are low risk and known and already in play. So that would just be a contrast that I've observed in working in an organization that's founded and centered on working on adaptively for continuous improvement.
Thanks, Kalika. And it also, I think, brings up the idea that we discussed within the last couple of weeks, this idea of leading from the middle as well, and how you can influence what's happening kind of above and even beside and below, and understanding that you do have power as individuals to be able to influence that work in that kind of 360 environment. And what role are you actually taking to help influence that to move the work forward? Okay, we're going to move forward now. So I had mentioned the results. Here's the opportunity. I'm going to invite Peyton to come up to talk about the shared performance. And Peyton, take it away.
Thank you, Stephanie. And thanks to each of you for kind of remaining and thinking and pushing and moving towards change. I just want to give you your cookies now. Kalika will explain that in a little bit. But one of the things that we wanted to do that Stephanie spoke about was really, our shared measurement. And I know last week you all talked really about, how it's so critical to have that shared measurement. So before we move on briefly to the next slide, I want us to reflect on that reflection there about when you disconnect at the end of these calls, when you log off of Zoom, how do you know if you, in your person, in your role, were successful during these calls? Alternatively, like, how are you making it, and it is a very broad word, so the situation, the ability to be in these calls, the container, someone's day a little bit better, for how are you making it better for others? So as we think about what work we're doing, and we're going to jump into some of how you all are evaluating, I want you to really think about, like, how do you define your success within this container? So on the next slide here, I want us to look at a few things. I'll give you a chance to read this over, but the green box are areas that we have asked about, that we've polled about over the course of these calls. The white box on the right are the data that we pulled from last week's chat box when we asked, how are you all evaluated in your job? So I'll give you about a minute to read that over, and then we'll just talk through this a little bit and speak about how we can bring about more shared measurement. All right, so these two kind of columns here, again, the left column, the green box, speaks to how we have continued to poll and survey and things that we've asked: attendance, sector representation, your handle on some of the different competencies, stress levels at this time, stress levels in your organization. And that is really all for, for the backbone to really recognize how this container, this collaborative action network, this CAN, is doing. How are we saying we are doing a good job? And on the right here, we have that white box again, and that is the data that you provided, telling us how are you evaluated in your work. And we really want to bring those together. We spent, I think, the past couple of weeks talking about some of the surveys that we've done, and I just want to be fully transparent in saying that the backbone team has had really conversations about how to bring these two things together, and recognizing that it's not easy. But Stephanie, said something really, really clear today, that the right box, that white box, is really oftentimes your daily focus. How are you evaluated in your day-to-day job? And what we really want to do is figure out how to tie in the things that we're doing in this call to impact that daily focus. For me, for instance, I know that when I'm in a really productive meeting, I leave that meeting, my head is full of ideas, and the first thing I reach for is a pen and paper to just furiously note take. Here are the steps I want to take. Here's the data. I'm a data guy. Here's the data I need. I draw some charts. I draw some check boxes. I have my to-do list. But all of those things, for me, the symbols of a good meeting, like, that's how I measure I was productive, because I was engaged, I was taking notes, I'm fully ready to go. And those things actually affect the job that I'm able to do, because now I feel a little bit more organized. I feel that I have some clarity. I feel that I'm able to calm down and go about whatever it is that, you know, I'm looking at, whether it's population data or whether it's data on racial equity or, you know, how to facilitate better. So I want to give you all time within the chat box or verbally to think about not only what other areas are you evaluated on in your work, but also how can we as a container think about the work that we are doing together, and how can we come up with shared measurement to say that this is what we consider to be a successful meeting. And the yellow highlights here are some measures that are probably a little bit more broad. All of the measures are extremely valid and, you know, great for evaluation, but the amount of encouragement and enrichment within the focus population, the elevation of inclusive practices, and families feeling supported, informed, and empowered, that those are things that you all are evaluated on, as you said, and those are things that can really be helpful to make sure that we are measuring ourselves on, so that at the end of each call, there's an elevation of inclusive practices. We are continually pushing you to inform, support, and empower families, or encourage and enrich the focus populations. So really what I'm getting at is, how can we bring these two things together? How can we think of a means of doing the work within this collective, measuring it, and having that measurement tie into the daily focus that you all have? Again, I know that that's a lot, but I do want to just bring that up, and this is a continued piece of work, but in the time that we have, if you want to type in, or if you just want to verbally speak out of things that you're evaluated on, or how the work within this can be measured so that it reflects on what you're evaluating. Sorry, reflects on how you're being evaluated at work.
One thing I might add is really important is being able to shift into all of us on this call shifting from being individuals to being a part of a collective or a coalition. And one of those things, our team yesterday was talking about the word community and what the word community meant. And one of the themes that came out of there was having shared experience. So I'll make up, like, if skydiving is a thing that we all liked, I don't like skydiving, so this wouldn't work. But if skydiving was a passion that we all had, we might measure how often we went skydiving, because that common thread amongst us would be that passion for that experience. And until this group has a shared measure, it's really hard to say we are that community, because we have to find that shared thing that we all have in common, and that's what holds us accountable. And if we might imagine continuing to check in with each other twice a year for the next 10 years or something like that, what would be the thing that we would first greet each other and say, this is how that thing is still going? I'm still skydiving, and I've still been going, you know, every month. So I think being able to find that thing is the thing that really holds groups together, that shared value or shared passion. So inviting us to think about what that thing is. What is that thing that's valued in your area of focus?
And I'll just add that, you know, again, this is performance measures. So what we're asking of you and what we're asking you to think about is ways to measure this collective more clearly and in a longitudinal way, so that, you know, like Kalika said, if we got together every week, every month, every 2 months for the next however many years, every time we get together, we have this trend of this one thing, these two things, these 5 things that we are doing together, so that each of our jobs can be more effective. Each of the roles that we play and each of our daily areas of focus are more effective moving forward. So again, this is I do recognize that bringing these two things together is it is work and it is a challenge, and so I want to leave this open for us, but I will pass it to Kalika to really speak on our next steps and a little bit about cookies.
Before we move on, Peyton, I'm gonna poke a little bit.
Okay.
And I'm gonna ask, let's see here, Jamie. I know you shared last week, but what is something that you hold as productivity or evidence of success for you in Kids Quest?
Yeah, one of the things that I hold evident of success is really through looking at the partners that we have and how we're engaging with those partners. So it could be amount of times that we engage with them or how we have changed our engagement with them. One of the big things that we have been doing as an organization is really looking at how we are engaging with partners and how we're using them as experts in their field, and then how Kids Quest is an expert in their field. So for me, it is engaging. It is looking at as who have we been engaging with, and how has that partnership changed?
Awesome, thank you. Can I just check in with is there anybody else in this group that like thinks about the partners that they have, the people that they work with? I'm not seeing many body movement here. Okay, I'm gonna invite Jen. Jen, what are some things that you track and hold as success in your work?
Which Jen?
You.
Right.
Jen B.
I actually was thinking about partners as well. So I'm with Imagine Housing, and I have had two really different roles at the agency. The first, there's a case manager. So we were really focused on kind of that individual one-on-one case management basis, looking at housing stability and being able to connect folks with resources. In my new role, I do a lot of community engagement. So working with a lot of individuals to really connect them to different ways to engage in the work that we do. So whether that's through partner organizations, volunteers, those are the two biggest ones. So I was thinking about volunteers and different ways to engage them, how long they stay, as well as, you know, how they grow in their role as a volunteer at Imagine.
Thank you. Is there anybody else that thinks about volunteers and tracking their growth or retention? I know the Y does. I used to track their hours for them. I know that one. Okay, I'll invite you, Heather. Heather, do you want to speak to things that you're tracking as measurement of success in your area of focus?
Currently, right now, not so much with volunteers because of just where we're at. I mean, right now, we just opened our doors, so our success, I think, right now is looking at the various types of engagement in different outlets between the virtual as well as the in-person, since now it's the in-person, but just how it's a bit of collecting the stories of how much people are missing, so that a qualitative experience of what they've missed about the Y, or what they've missed about the connection to community that way, and just how word of mouth is going to travel in this of how they experience the Y.
Heather, it's Stephanie. I'm wondering if I could just dig in a little bit on that, just as an example for this group. So since volunteering is different now, how you all are engaging with those volunteers, is there a measurement, for example, of how and when you are reaching out, how many times you're reaching out to volunteers, and when you're reaching out to volunteers to get those stories that you were just talking about? It's kind of changing your own practices, what you're doing specifically.
I wouldn't say there's any direct pattern with volunteers at this point, aside from board meetings, which is where we have our advisory volunteer board members. Right now, it is for me. I'm collecting more of just from my direct interaction, because thankfully I have staff. Right now I'm supposed to be on the floor in the stations, like welcoming our members coming back into the building, because again, just in this structure of how we have to function. So there's more of that, like just in person, like switching from being more of administrative, but being more frontline with the rest of the team to just make our operations work.
I want to thread something. I was really strategic in the 3 people that I chose. And I want to invite the 3 of you, now knowing Kids Quest, the Why, and Imagine Housing. What's the through line between the 3 of your organizations? I guarantee you if I stuck the 3 of you in a room, you could come up with a through line. And one of the challenges is when organizations are working in isolation, they don't usually have dialogue about what's the thing that we're all looking at in the community. That's shared performance measure. That's working cross organization, cross neighborhood. Like even if we weren't organizations and like you lived on another street and I lived on another street, but we all really cared about curbside appeal and we all made a commitment to measure how often we mow our lawns, then we could start to track, because now we're all committed to mowing our lawns on a regular basis, that we're seeing curbside appeal go up in our neighborhood. I chose those 3 organizations because I think there's some clear through lines there. And that's what we're trying to get us all together on. Because ultimately, if we can all come on these calls and say like, we're all tracking the number of kids that we're serving, or we're all tracking the number of people we serve that have housing. Because like the Why, for example, asks people, where's your place of residence? We want to know your mailing address. And if they got someone, and if there was a box on that application that says, I don't currently have housing, that would be an indicator that that was an issue. And I'm sure Jamie and their organization, if they had a little kid that came in and said, my mommy and daddy and I live in our car, they wouldn't hesitate to say, let's talk to mommy and daddy and try to figure that out together. That might be a thing that's not a direct service, but it's something you all could talk to each other. And they might call Jen and say, hey, Jen, we keep seeing this trend of kids who don't have housing. What can we all do together? We're collecting that information. Jamie, I know you worked on a campaign to create a central application for summer programs. It wasn't because you all were starting to build a new organization together. It was just like, here's a common theme that we all get information on, and how can we all tweak something, but just by talking to each other. So I just wanted to take pause and go a little bit deeper, because once we find that thing that we all really care about, or we all get insights and information on, that's the thing that we can leverage, because nobody else knows that. Like Eastside Pathways doesn't talk to little kids. I'm never going to have a little kid say to me that in my professional role. I can't provide that information. So that's the kind of thing I just wanted to like model that for us, because I think sometimes it's mental gymnastics, like we're really in our programs or we're really in our organization, but to like zoom out and say like, gosh, if Heather and Jamie and Jen kept talking to each other about the number of kids that were experiencing homelessness, and they just checked in each other on a quarterly basis, we're actually seeing a huge increase in that. Well, then that's going to help Imagine Housing go, okay, we know for a fact, we've got data that shows what this spike or this growth looks like. So I can speak to my funders about that and figure out how we get ahead of that thing. And she's leveraging other organizations that's not necessarily their direct service, but they can help inform that. And the Y also does have programs around housing, right? So just wanted to use that through line as an example of like why it's important to have the dialogue and get to a thing that we can all have insights and data on, and use that to help us work better together. Okay. Now I'm gonna move us on. I didn't want to like miss that, because I see people like working with it, but I wanted to make sure like we got deep into that. Stephanie or Peyton, did you have anything else to add to that before we go?
The only thing I'll add is I think the example that you gave is fantastic. I love it, because I think that helps make it really clear, especially if you're in a focus group, is up-leveling that, and what do those performance measures look like for this group as a whole. And it's really it can be the technical or the adaptive, and how we're coming together. It's just another level of that exact same example that Kalika gave. And it could be anything from, you know, do we all have a common performance measure of how we're engaging with community most impacted. You know, how many times are we actually reaching out? How are we changing our own behaviors to reach out to community impacted? How many times are we showing up here, as we've talked about? So just wanted to make that, it's a great example, and up leveling it for this common group too.
Thank you. Sue, you look like you had something to say.
Yeah, I'm really taken by Kalika's example, because this is the essence of what Eastside Pathways is. Getting people to really think about what it is that is sort of a common thread that we've never connected together, we haven't thought about, and then bringing it together to help the community. I thought that was absolutely excellent. And thanks for calling on me, because I can say it a lot faster than I can type it. So thanks. That was really good.
Thank you. Awesome. I'm glad that helped. Okay, I'm gonna, I know that I'm eating up your time to work together, so I don't want to take up too much more, but one of the things I was going to lift up, the cookie that Peyton set me up for, was I just want to acknowledge, as we're thinking through an asset lens around what is the positive feedback or affirmations we get in working together, also recognizing that in my lived experience, some of the evidence of me being on the leading edge, particularly when doing social justice or racial equity work, is actually a lot of heat, a lot of pushback, a lot of discomfort. And I've had to recalibrate my association to that discomfort as evidence of progress. Because if I'm looking for high fives or a cookie, when I'm pushing back on systems, when I'm pushing back on unconsciousness, when I'm pushing back on these things, I'm going to fail miserably, because typically when you're on the leading edge, when you're standing out in the front, when you're exploring new things, when you're taking risks, there's actually a lot of discomfort. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and lift that up. If anybody else is experiencing discomfort, especially if you're working in isolation, that's kind of the reality of doing this sort of work, adaptive work or leading edge work. The other piece is just always inviting us to be on the right side of that accountability pathway. We've named this before, that we've seen a decrease of participation, and always acknowledge, how do we build a container and relationships to ultimately hold and continue to move this work. This is why, as Sue spoke about collective impact and Eastside Pathways, the backbone's role. The critical component of having a backbone is whether or not everybody shows up or how consistent they show up, this container is still held. The data in this container is still held. And we support and continue to move that. So that allows people to come in and out, organizations to come in and out. But also acknowledging the reality and staying on the right side of the accountability pathway to say, I can't do this right now, but I might find a solution, which is tapping someone else in, or having a dialogue with my leadership table, or having a dialogue with my community about, if this really is a priority and a value to figure this thing out, what might we do to ensure that we have the leadership in the room necessary to continue to move the work forward. We're going to move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. I'm going to continue to invite you to use the remaining time today to focus on doing BART, Boundary of Authority, Role, and Task. I believe all of you were here last week, so I won't go too deep into it, but the link for your workbook will be in the chat, inviting all of you to open that up. And although there aren't a lot of people on this call, I think it's a really great time to go deep and have open dialogue about your own boundaries. Have some really specific dialogue about, you know, I'll speak for myself. I have 3 kids that are all going to be doing remote learning. I came to Stephanie and said, I'm going to need some time off because I need to be fully present with them so that I can help on the board them. That way our team was able to plan around that versus me just not showing up because I'm maxed out and I didn't say that ahead of time. So take this time to have really open dialogue and think about, clearly there's a passion and commitment to leading this work, and at the same time I'm a human and I have limitations, and how do we build a plan for success that has time boundaries? We're going to press play on this date because that'll allow me the time I need to get my family ready to go back to school. So I would just invite us all to open that chat box, continue to talk about those boundaries, also talk about the authority. Stephanie gave us some talking points earlier about how do you look in a 360 degree around who's around you and who you can activate and mobilize to help continue to carry some of the weight, as well as provide more tools and resources. The example I just gave was, I've heard people in the housing group talk a lot about like, hey, we know that housing is going to be more and more of an issue, but we don't necessarily have numbers on that. Well, Jamie's organization might be an organization that carries early indicators of that. Like, we are seeing these kids on a daily basis. Jen might not see them until they're actually experiencing homelessness, but Jamie might be seeing them every day. And that mom might come and say, hey, Jamie, do you have any resources? Because this is the last month we can afford our rent. Jamie would be able to get that data way before. Kids Quest can get that data way before they landed on Jen's doorstep, which would give Jen, Imagine Housing, more time to figure things out before that person ended up on their doorstep. So those are those examples, again, of how do you work together differently to fix the system? Because currently, I don't know, I'm imagining Jen and Imagine Housing doesn't see these people until it's already an issue. I'm imagining they're not like, hey, in 6 months, a quarantine is going to happen and I'm going to get furloughed and I'm not going to be able to pay my rent. I'm not psychic. I don't know that. So the whole point of this collective impact is leveraging each other so that we can help fix those things in the system. So I'm going to stop talking. Please open the chat box, get your workbook open. Ultimately, by continuing to have this dialogue together, we can figure out what is that small test of change, that one prototype that's going to, next slide, please, be the thing that we do differently together. And that could be simple as just talking, making a commitment to talk. And I know the housing community group talked a lot about all the different meetings you all have on a weekly basis to help try to do that. So as always, if you need support when you're in your breakout groups, please feel free to click the Ask for Help button and one of our staff members will come join you. We'll see you back in a little bit. Nothing like getting caught off mid-sentence. As always, invite you to use the chat box to finish your thoughts, and also wanting to acknowledge that our gracious Zoom DJ Vicky does stay on the call for an additional, up to an additional 15 minutes if you would like to get back into your groups to continue this work. And even more importantly, you can always set up time with each other outside of Eastside Pathways to continue your dialogue. I know I always really appreciate seeing the back and forth emails. And I just really want to appreciate each and everybody for coming in. I know we had a really rich conversation with food and housing, so I hope that this felt productive for you all. And one other thing I'll offer before I pass it to Stephanie to close us out is I want you to know that we do not have an emotional attachment to whether or not you attend these meetings. I care about each of you as human beings. There is no shade or judgment if you do not come. Know that when we're asking you for feedback about those things, it's so that we can strategize to ensure that the way we're coordinating these calls is serving you, because ultimately we know that you all are the ones who can help lead change in our community. So I just want you to know that we really appreciate that open dialogue and feedback, which is also a shameless plug because next week we are going to be having a dialogue about how do we do some forecasting and take that prototype and the conversations you've been having and get them on the calendar. So please be prepared, take some time to reflect, and know that next week when you come to these calls in your groups, you're going to have a dialogue about when are we going to press play on this thing, who's going to be at the table, what do we need to get it done, and then you'll have an opportunity to report that out in large groups so you can get some support and curiosity. I know I can use an example that Tammy shared, that there's a really critical action step that needs to be taken on behalf of the state of Washington in service of providing the food necessary for youth in this community. Being able to share that out amongst all of us and tap into all the tools and resources and influence that we all have is a critical component and value of working together in critical collective impact. So really thank you. And then one other thing is I want to invite you to send an email to your group and just say, here's what I heard today. Be that messenger, hold yourself accountable, and don't shame the people who weren't here, because we don't shame you when you're not. So it might be kind of cool just to send out some notes to your team and say, hey, I missed you here today, but here's what I heard. And this is what we're going to be working on next week, and I look forward to seeing you. So I just want to offer that as a way that you might help ensure that you have the support and the team you need next week, so you can be a part of that accountability. I'm going to pass it to Stephanie to close us out.
Sorry, I had to get myself off mute for a second here. Thanks, Kalika. And thanks to all of you for continuing to stay in this work. It is challenging work, and this is where we're on the edges here. We're on the boundaries and the edges, and we're pushing our edges and making our comfort zone that much bigger. And so when we're making our comfort zone bigger, we know we can move forward with this work at full speed. So, but it takes pushing the edges, as Kalika has said many times, to create that bigger space. So I want to reemphasize again, next week, you'll have the opportunity, and even between now and next week, have the opportunity to connect with your groups to start to think about what the 3 weeks of your small test of change look like, how you need to be scheduling, what does that scheduling look like, what role specifically you're taking in that small test of change. And so be thinking about what that looks like specifically. We also will have the opportunity, again, I want to emphasize what Kalika said, we don't want to create silos between the focus groups. And so where there are opportunities of cross-sharing and supporting each other for small tests of change, we want to give you the chance to share what you're doing briefly with each other, so that where there are connector points, those connector points can be made and supported. So that's looking into next week, some of the things that we'll be doing. Are there any thoughts, closing thoughts, comments before we get to our questions, before we get to our one-word checkout that folks want to bring up? Thank you. Debbie, I see your comment there. All right, as we did last week, I just want to invite people to share a one-word checkout that describes your experience here, and feel free to unmute or add it into the chat. Thanks, Tammy. I see grateful. One-word checkout. Enlightened. Thanks, Linda. Grounded. Thought-provoking. Thank you, Sue. Validated and heard. Thanks, Brunel. Okay, now that we are at 11:30, I'm just going to say thank you again. We'll see you next week. Again, the platform is open for you guys to connect as you wish. And until next week, be well. We'll see you then.